In 1988, U.S. military pistols began breaking apart mid-fire. M9 slides fractured catastrophically, sending steel into the faces of American soldiers. The government blamed Beretta. A $75 million contract hung in the balance. But the M9 had passed every required test. Something else was destroying the military's last line of defense, and it would take years and a federal lawsuit to prove what was really behind the failures. Reports arrived at the Pentagon with the same blunt headline: M9 pistol slides, fractured in live fire, had sent steel flying into the faces of American soldiers. The first injuries came in October 1986, followed by a string of incidents across Army and airborne units. 4 men were hurt, one with a deep cut to his forearm, another struck in the head by a broken slide. The Government Accountability Office compiled 14 such cases in less than 2 years, each one a black mark against the new standard-issue pistol. Army press releases tried to contain the fallout, but the story broke into the national press. The contract with Beretta, worth $75 million, stood in jeopardy. Congressional committees demanded to know why a weapon that had passed every official test was now failing in the field. The Department of Defense issued a formal warning. Unless Beretta could explain and resolve the failures, the contract would be cancelled under federal regulations for defective supplies. Inside the Army, the atmosphere turned adversarial. Technical teams scoured the slides for evidence of metallurgical flaws. Beretta braced for legal action and public blame. Soldiers questioned the reliability of the pistol they carried, while procurement officers faced the possibility of restarting a years-long, multi-million-dollar acquisition process. The source of the failures remained a mystery, but the consequences were immediate and severe. The M9's future, and the safety of those who carried it, hung in the balance. In 1977, the Air Force submitted a request to Congress for $499 million to replenish its dwindling 9mm ammunition stocks. The proposal, tucked into Public Law 94361, drew sharp questions from lawmakers, who wondered why the Air Force, traditionally less reliant on sidearms, needed such a large supply. Committee transcripts recorded the confusion. More than 25 handgun models and over 100 ammunition types were being fielded across the services. The logistical chaos exposed by this audit forced the Department of Defense to act. Late that year, the Joint Service Small Arms Program, JSSAP, was chartered with a clear directive: develop a single standardized 9mm pistol and ammunition system for all branches. The JSSAP board, led by Lieutenant General William J. Gainey, set out strict benchmarks. Reliability would be measured by mean rounds between failures, MRBF, with a minimum target of 625 rounds. Endurance testing began at the Air Force Armament Laboratory, where engineers ran the new pistols through 10,000-round cycles. Reports from Tyndall Air Force Base showed the Beretta 92FS averaging around 2,000 MRBF, sometimes higher, more than triple the requirement. The Smith & Wesson and Colt entries lagged behind, with MRBF figures under 1,200. The Beretta's performance did not just impress the technical staff, it provided a numeric baseline that would haunt later debates. But numbers alone could not erase skepticism. The Army's logistics branch noted the Beretta's higher spare parts count, 24 distinct part numbers versus 18 for the SIG. Meanwhile, Air Force engineers flagged pressure spikes during testing, even as the Beretta's slide showed the lowest variance. Still, the early JSSAP findings gave ammunition, literal and political, to those pushing for a single sidearm. The MRBF metric, born from this era of chaos, would become the yardstick by which every competitor and every controversy would be measured. Army engineers arrived at Fort Benning in February 1981, carrying sealed crates marked for classified use only. The Small Arms Research Directorate, SARD, had been quietly authorized to conduct its own trials out of sight from the Air Force and far from the congressional spotlight. Their protocol went beyond the standard endurance cycle. Pistols were buried in fine Georgia sand, shaken and then fired until failure. The sand ingress phase, detailed in Joint Classified Document JCD 81115, was designed to break what the Air Force tests had only stressed. The results were recorded in a memo, AA 8103, stamped confidential and routed through a secure channel. The Beretta 92FS, which had dominated the earlier Air Force trials, posted an MRBF of 11,800 in the Army's harsher environment, still above the threshold, but lower than the Air Force's numbers. The SIG P-226 and an experimental Colt trailed behind. But the real shock came during the sand ingress runs. 4 Beretta slides fractured, each failure traced to the rear locking block lug. SARD officers flagged the slides for metallurgical inspection, noting the Italian-made steel and its heat treatment process as possible culprits. The memo called for additional metallurgical inspection of Italian-made slides, a phrase that would echo for years in procurement debates. Within the Army, these findings were not shared with other services or Congress. Instead, SARD's skepticism grew. The Air Force's glowing reports were quietly set aside, replaced by internal doubts about the Beretta's long-term durability. The tension between the services, once an undercurrent, now surfaced in procurement meetings and technical briefings. As the Open XM9 competition approached, the Army's secret data cast a long shadow, raising new questions about what counted as reliable and who got to decide. 8 manufacturers answered the Army's call for a new service pistol in 1984, each bringing their own claims of reliability and innovation. The field included Beretta, Sig Sauer, Smith & Wesson, Colt, Heckler & Koch, Walter, Steyr, and FN. Their pistols were lined up for a public contest that would leave reputations and millions of dollars on the table. The Army's evaluation board used a scoring matrix that assigned 60% of the total to technical performance, with mean rounds between failures, MRBF, serving as the central yardstick. Price, logistics, and prior performance filled out the rest. Beretta's proposal showed a total package price of just over $12 million for 210,000 pistols, undercutting Sig Sauer by a narrow margin. The MRBF figures, already the subject of inter-service dispute, again placed Beretta at the top, with numbers that exceeded the minimum requirement by a wide margin. On August 6, 1984, the Army announced Beretta as the winner. The decision triggered immediate protests from Sig Sauer and Smith & Wesson, who alleged price manipulation and unfair technical scoring. Smith & Wesson demanded a retest, arguing that the original trials had been stacked in Beretta's favor. The Army refused, citing adherence to the published criteria and the need to maintain the procurement schedule. With public scrutiny mounting, the Government Accountability Office launched a forensic audit, GAO 85128, reviewing procurement files, scoring sheets, and correspondence. The Government Accountability Office confirmed the 8-firm field, validated the scoring matrix, and found no evidence of corruption or hidden deals. The board's application of the rules, including the controversial price rounding, was ruled consistent with the solicitation. Smith & Wesson's retest request was denied, and the protests were formally dismissed. The GAO's findings did little to calm the institutional resentment or public suspicion. The Beretta M9 was now the official sidearm, but the process had left deep scars. Legal challenges and audit reports became part of the weapon's origin story, embedding doubt and controversy into the very foundation of the M9's service life. Scanning electron microscopes revealed a fracture pattern that did not fit the script of shoddy metallurgy. The slide failures that haunted the M9's early years traced back to a single, measurable anomaly: overpressure ammunition. Olin Winchester, the government's contracted supplier, had loaded 9mm rounds using civilian powder data into NATO spec brass, a case just small enough to spike chamber pressure by as much as 30% above the pistol's design limit. Forensic tables showed the difference: a NATO case at 0.45 cubic centimeters, Winchester's at 0.40. The same powder charge, less space, a sudden surge in stress that no proof load test could predict. Beretta's engineers presented the evidence in court, backed by Army and Navy ballistics labs. The slides had passed every magnetic particle inspection, every proof load, every quality control step required by contract. The failures, the court ruled, were not a defect in design or heat treatment. They were the result of ammunition outside the intended envelope. In 1999, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims awarded Beretta $3.2 million in damages, holding the Army responsible for redesign costs and the full recall of affected slides. The verdict forced a rewrite of the official record. The M9's most public failure was, in fact, a systems error, one born in a loading bench, not on a factory floor. In 2005, the Marine Corps sidestepped the bureaucracy and ordered the M9A1, a sidearm shaped by lessons learned the hard way. The new model arrived with a Picatinny rail for lights, a corrosion-resistant coating, and a reworked feed ramp. Nickel-plated magazines, tested to survive sand and grit, became standard issue. The modification order, MCO 1125-8, made these upgrades mandatory for every pistol delivered under the new contract. Field data showed the changes. Worked. Feeding failures dropped by more than half, and sand-induced pitting on slides fell by 60%. But hardware alone could not solve what was coming. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, maintenance discipline collapsed under the strain of deployment. Christopher Bartocci, tasked with inspecting more than 1,700 M9s across 12 forward bases, found that 84% of recoil springs and 71% of locking blocks had been pushed well past their service limits. Replacement parts, often sourced from unapproved vendors, failed to meet Beretta's original specifications. Most unit armories had no accurate round count logs. Failures multiplied, with recoil springs stretched beyond 5,000 rounds, locking blocks cracking after 10,000 rounds, and slides fracturing at 16,000 rounds. Bartocci's report traced 93% of catastrophic failures to pistols fed with non-standard ammunition or fitted with substandard parts. The official maintenance intervals, 5,000 rounds for springs and 10,000 for locking blocks, were ignored in the rush of combat. The result was a weapon blamed for failures that belonged to the system that sustained it. Even now, the debate outlives the pistol. Reliability data, over 35,000 mean rounds between failures, sits beside stories of lives changed in seconds. Institutional memory clings to nostalgia and blame. But for those who carried it, the last line of defense is never just a weapon. What do you think endures?